Out of every 100 radio operators who landed on the beaches of Normandy, only 12 were still alive 48 hours later. They carried the most vital piece of equipment in the entire invasion, yet they were simultaneously described as the most valuable and at the same time the most hunted soldiers on the battlefield. Their life expectancy was measured not in days or weeks, but in hours. And now you're going to see why. When you think about D-Day, you probably picture the massive landing craft, the machine gun nests, or the paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines. But there was one piece of equipment that could turn the tide of an entire battle, yet made its operator a walking target with a giant bullseye painted on his back. The radio was both the lifeline that coordinated the largest amphibious assault in history and a death sentence for the young men who carried it. June 6, 1944. The coast of Normandy stretched for 50 miles along the French shoreline, defended by Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This wasn't just a series of bunkers and beach obstacles. It was the most heavily fortified coastline in human history, bristling with artillery, machine guns, and seasoned German troops who had been preparing for this exact moment for 4 years. The Allies knew that communication would be everything. Without radios, the invasion would collapse into chaos. Individual units would fight blind, naval gunfire couldn't be directed, air support would be useless, and reinforcements wouldn't know where they were needed most. That's why every assault company carried at least one radio operator, and larger units had several. But the Germans knew this too. To understand why carrying a radio on D-Day was essentially a suicide mission, we need to look at what these soldiers actually carried. The standard infantry radio was the SCR-300, weighing 35 pounds when fully loaded with batteries. It was a backpack-mounted unit with a distinctive whip antenna that extended 4 feet above the operator's head. The antenna was necessary for the radio to work, but it also made the operator visible from hundreds of yards away. The SCR-300 had an effective range of 3 miles on flat terrain, but the rocky coastline and interference from other radios often cut that in half. Battery life was just 8 hours of continuous use, so operators carried spare batteries that added another 15 pounds to their load. That meant a radio operator was carrying 50 pounds of equipment before adding his rifle, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. But the weight wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that whip antenna sticking up like a flag. German snipers and machine gunners had been specifically trained to identify and target radio operators first. They knew that killing the radio operator would cripple an entire unit's ability to call for support, coordinate attacks, or even report their position. Radio operators also had to stop and set up their equipment to make calls. While other soldiers could dive for cover and stay low, radio operators had to find elevated positions with clear sight lines to establish contact. They became stationary targets for minutes at a time, completely exposed while trying to reach their command posts. The psychological pressure was immense. These were often 19- and 20-year-old kids who knew they were carrying equipment that made them priority targets. They had to operate under constant fire while managing complex radio procedures, encryption codes, and call signs. One mistake in transmission could give away their unit's position to German radio intercept teams who were constantly listening. Training tried to prepare them, but nothing could simulate the chaos of actual combat. At training camps in England, radio operators learned to set up and operate their equipment in under 2 minutes. They memorized dozens of call signs and frequencies. They practiced encrypting messages using code books that changed daily. But when they hit the beaches of Normandy, everything they'd learned was tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Now, let me tell you about Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, a 20-year-old radio operator from the 1st Infantry Division who landed on Omaha Beach at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th. Chen's company was part of the second wave, tasked with establishing a communications link between the beach and the destroyer USS Satterlee, which would provide naval gunfire support. As Chen's landing craft approached the shore, German artillery was already zeroing in on the beach. Machine gun fire from the bluffs was cutting down soldiers before they even reached dry sand. Chen struggled through the surf with his 50-pound radio pack, watching men around him fall as bullets churned the water white. He made it to the seawall and immediately tried to establish contact with the Satterlee, but his first radio check revealed that shrapnel had damaged his antenna. With German fire raking the beach, Chen had to climb onto the seawall to extend his backup antenna. The moment he appeared above the wall, a German sniper's bullet shattered his radio's handset. Chen was now carrying a useless 50-pound weight, but he couldn't abandon it. His company needed naval gunfire to suppress the German positions, or they'd all die on that beach. He crawled along the seawall until he found another radio operator, Private Martinez, who'd been shot through the shoulder but whose radio was still functional. Together, they managed to contact the Satterlee and direct accurate naval gunfire onto the German machine gun nests. But the process took 12 minutes of continuous radio transmission, during which both men were completely exposed. Martinez was killed by a mortar around 30 seconds after they finished the call. Chen survived the day but was shot and killed 18 hours later while trying to call in artillery support during the advance inland. But Chen wasn't the only radio operator to face impossible odds that day. Staff Sergeant William Murphy landed with the 29th Infantry Division at 7:15 a.m., carrying an SCR-536 handheld radio for the short-range communication. Murphy's job was to maintain contact between his company and battalion headquarters as they advanced off the beach. Murphy's landing craft hit a sandbar 200 yards from shore. As soldiers jumped into chest-deep water, German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions in the cliffs. Murphy watched his company commander get cut down just 50 yards from the beach. With no officers left alive, the company began to fragment into small groups of confused and terrified soldiers. Murphy knew he had to get to high ground to reach battalion headquarters. He crawled up the bluff under constant fire, his radio crackling with desperate calls from other units requesting support, medical evacuation, and ammunition resupply. When he finally reached a position where he could transmit, Murphy discovered that his frequency was being jammed by German radio interference. He switched to an emergency frequency and spent 40 minutes trying to coordinate artillery support for 3 different companies that were pinned down on the beach below. German snipers were actively hunting for him, and twice he had to relocate when bullets started impacting around his position. Murphy was shot through the leg during his 3rd transmission but continued calling in fire missions until a mortar round landed directly in his position 6 hours after the landing. But if you think these stories were incredible, consider the case of Corporal James Mitchell, a radio operator with the 82nd Airborne Division who was dropped behind enemy lines 12 hours before the beach landings began. Mitchell's job was to establish communication between scattered paratrooper units and coordinate with the beach assault when it began. Mitchell's transport plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the drop zone, and he jumped at just 400 feet altitude. His parachute barely had time to deploy before he crashed through the roof of a German farmhouse. Miraculously, he survived the impact, but his radio was smashed and he was behind enemy lines with no way to communicate. Mitchell knew that his unit was supposed to capture and hold a bridge 3 miles away, but without radio contact, he had no way to coordinate with other scattered paratroopers. He spent the night moving through German-occupied territory, collecting parts from other destroyed radios he found with dead paratroopers. By dawn on June 6th, Mitchell had cobbled together a functioning radio from pieces of 3 different units. He climbed a church tower in the village of Sainte-Mère-Église and established contact with both paratrooper units and the beach assault forces. For 6 hours, Mitchell coordinated attacks, called in airstrikes, and directed reinforcements while German troops searched the village below. Mitchell's position was finally discovered when a German radio intercept team triangulated his transmissions. Enemy soldiers stormed the church tower at 2 p.m., but Mitchell continued transmitting until the moment they reached his position. He was captured alive but died 3 days later in a German field hospital from wounds sustained during his capture. The official casualty statistics for radio operators on D-Day are staggering. Of the estimated 800 radio operators who participated in the initial assault, over 700 were killed or wounded within the first 48 hours. That's an 88% casualty rate, higher than any other military occupation in the entire war. Radio equipment failure rates were equally devastating. Sand, salt water, and combat damage rendered 60% of all radios inoperable within 6 hours of landing. Many units lost all communication capability and had to rely on runners and signal flags to coordinate their movements. The entire communication plan for the invasion nearly collapsed multiple times during the first day. But despite these horrific losses, radio operators played a crucial role in the success of D-Day. Naval gunfire directed by radio operators destroyed hundreds of German defensive positions. Artillery strikes, coordinated through radio communications, broke up German counterattacks before they could reach the beaches. Medical evacuation requests transmitted by radio operators saved thousands of wounded soldiers who would have otherwise died. The psychological impact on surviving radio operators was profound. Many suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They had not only endured constant combat, but carried the weight of knowing that their comrades' lives depended on their ability to maintain communication under impossible conditions. The lessons learned from D-Day radio operations revolutionized military communications. Equipment was redesigned to be more durable and waterproof. Radio procedures were simplified to reduce transmission time. Multiple redundant communication systems were developed so that losing one radio operator wouldn't cripple an entire unit. Today, modern military communications are digital, encrypted, and much more reliable than the analog radios of World War II. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Communication is the nervous system of any military operation, and the soldiers who maintain that communication often pay the ultimate price. The radio operators of D-Day exemplified the paradox of modern warfare. They carried the tools that made victory possible, but those same tools made them the most hunted men on the battlefield. Their sacrifice enabled the largest and most complex military operation in history to succeed, even though most of them didn't live to see that success. If you want to hear more stories about the unsung heroes of D-Day and World War II, make sure to subscribe and check out our video about why medics had a life expectancy of just 20 minutes in combat.